Landlocked countries would envy Egypt because it's not shortchanged on all sides. To the north, the country has a Mediterranean coastline stretching about 650 miles. To the east, there's the Red Sea coastline, which is around 620 miles long. Overall, there's plenty of room for getting fish, a crucial resource for Egypt, which suffers from food shortages. This is exactly what the country is working on. By 2023, Egypt had caught 2 million tons of fish. By the way, the country holds the top spot in Africa in this regard, but there's a catch. Even with all that coastline, 80% of Egypt's fish comes from the desert. Yes, right there, where it's hot and lifeless. And honestly, it's hard to imagine anyone associating desert with fish. Still, millions of tons of fish caught in Egypt could easily be called residents of the sands. Time to figure out what this country's come up with. Let's start by looking at the Mediterranean Sea. As we've already mentioned, Egypt has a long coastline that allows for fishing in the waters. And that's exactly what happened. The country actively fished in waters that are exploited by many other countries. Research shows that the catch was so intense that from 1920 to 2019, about 3.8 million tons of fish were removed from Egypt's Mediterranean waters. This led to a situation where the share of fishing, for example, sardines, in the total commercial catch dropped from 30% in 1950 to less than 4% in 1968. Yes, the main reason why there are fewer fish is the overfishing. However, in the 1960s, the Aswan Dam was built on the Nile River, a useful structure for the country, but it also played a role in reducing fish populations along Egypt's northern shores. The dam blocked the flow of nutrients from the Nile to the sea. In the 80s, the fish population returned to normal levels because the fertilizers from Egyptian agriculture were flowing into the main river. The fish were happy and their numbers increased. But it turned out to be temporary. In the 2000s, catches began to fluctuate again, and between 2011 and 2019, they actually dropped by almost 50%. And that's when what had been hidden from the eyes of regular people not involved in fishing came to light. Researchers started looking into where exactly the fishing was happening and realized that since the mid-1950s, fishing had been steadily spreading across the country. In other words, when the Egyptians drained the fish stocks in one location, they moved on to find a new fishing ground. And this cycle repeated endlessly. Then scientists started to study the food chain. Egyptian fishing in the Mediterranean ecosystem first depleted the populations of large predator fish at the top of the food chain, and then smaller species started disappearing too. In the end, it turned out that there was nowhere left to expand the catch area. Just so happened that ships couldn't go anywhere they wanted, and countries only have their own coastal territories. And in Egyptian waters, there's not much fish left. The result? Mediterranean fishing's at a low level. But there's also the Red Sea, right? It has a long coastline here too, stretching about 670 miles. On the one hand, it seems like a good alternative for Egypt instead of the Mediterranean, but that's just an illusion because the situation here is pretty much the same as with the Mediterranean. Researchers studied 55 fish species caught by Egypt in the Red Sea and concluded that 91% of them are overfished. This means Egyptians are catching them in such large amounts that the population can't replenish itself naturally. Geographic expansion doesn't help here either because, once again, other countries on the shores of the Red Sea won't stand for Egyptian vessels entering their waters. Moreover, it's worth noting that fishing from the seas and oceans is generally a highly unpredictable activity. The catch from the ocean or sea depends on a variety of different factors. For example, even the slightest change in currents or temperature fluctuations can be enough to make a certain species of fish move to another location where Egypt won't be able to catch it. And this is a country that really needs to know what volumes of fish will be caught because this is food, and Egypt has big problems with it. Now let's switch for a moment from fish to wheat and bread because it's precisely because of issues with them that the country is experiencing a food crisis right now. Bread in Egypt traditionally makes up 40% of all the calories consumed, and if that doesn't quite make clear how significant the product is, Egyptians consume twice as much wheat per person as the global average. There's just not much land available for growing it. After all, everyone knows Egypt is a desert, right? The areas available for wheat cultivation are the Nile and some desert greening projects. Even with these, it's still not enough, which is why Egypt is one of the world's largest importers of bread's main ingredient. Since the supply from the main exporters, Russia and Ukraine, has been disrupted, Egypt is currently facing a shortage of wheat and therefore bread. This is exactly why the country desperately needs food, the acquisition of which is easy to predict. And fishing from the Mediterranean and Red Seas, which is clearly vulnerable to many factors, is not helping with this at all. All of this is definitely enough to come up with a different way to get food. For example, they could farm fish right on Egypt's barren, sandy lands. Fish farming in the sands of Egypt's eastern Sahara actually started back in the mid-30s of the last century. This means that even back then, the country was already thinking about using its sandy lands, which weren't particularly useful for much else, for something beneficial. They introduced carp on 2 research farms. However, this didn't turn into a massive fish farming industry, as until the 60s they were just studying carp. However, in 1961, the Egyptians set up their first farm covering 296 acres. These were ponds in the sand where, based on research experience, African experts started growing flathead gray mullet and tilapia. The government realized this was a promising direction, so they decided to really focus on its development. By the mid-80s, 4 large hatcheries, 6 fish farms, and 5 fry collection stations had been built. All of this allowed the annual aquaculture production volume to increase from 17 to 45,000 tons. Now let's head to the northern part of Egypt, to the delta of the country's main river, the Nile. There's a city called Port Said. It's obviously related to fishing, but we need to go a little further east, right here. Can you see all the cells? These are ponds that the Egyptians created in the tough sands of their land. What you're looking at is a fish farming project called Alfuse. Of course, from a satellite, you can already see that there's quite a lot here, and yeah, there's a lot here. But let's go through it all step by step. First off, it's worth mentioning that the place is located on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea and the sands of the Sahara. Yes, the desert stretches all the way here. What does this mean? The location is pretty much unsuitable for creating anything useful, including fish farming. What the Egyptians call soil here is so salty that no plant or living organism can survive. Nevertheless, Egypt is famous for making use of its land that's good for nothing, so it managed to do it. The fish farming facility, as we can see, was built after all. Imagine over 5,900 ponds were dug in the sand for fish farming. Among them are 332 freshwater ponds where freshwater fish are grown. Yes, freshwater fish in salty sands, especially in such a large number of ponds, is quite odd but easily explainable. After all, reverse osmosis technology exists for a reason, turning salty water into fresh. So the Alfuse site has one such system that produces 198,000 gallons of water suitable for freshwater fish to thrive in. Besides the fish farming ponds, the Alfuse project includes 2 lakes covering 6,177 acres, which are there for recreational fishing. And apart from the water treatment plant, there are a huge number of other facilities. After all, Alfuse has all the infrastructure you need in one place. There's also another pretty surprising object in the desert, a factory that produces 40 tons of ice every day. There's also a fish sorting and packaging plant producing 8 tons a day. It's important to mention the fish feed, which of course is required in large quantities for such a massive project. Typically, the feed is ordered and arrives in several shipments. However, due to problems with wheat, Egypt realized that it was better not to rely on any shipments. So right on the Alfuse farm, they set up facilities where they produce the necessary feed. And the amount of fish food they produce here is enough to meet all local needs. The output reaches 6,000 tons. In addition, Alfuse is also a station where a lot of research takes place. They even set up a special lab here so people wouldn't have to go far. It's probably right there that very important research is taking place related to the breeding of a special fish. As stated by the head of the National Fish Resources Company, many scientists are working on creating an incubator for producing red tilapia, a new species of fish that's of high quality and thrives in salty water. Originally, tilapia is a freshwater fish, meaning that Egypt created many freshwater ponds at the Alfuse facility to raise them. However, after the research and development of the new species are completed, the Egyptians will have less work as they won't need to convert salty water into freshwater. After its opening in 2021, the Alfuse farm had a fish production of 460 tons, which then increased to 5,000 tons. By 2026, as officials say, the production will reach an incredible 12,000 tons. Do we really need to mention how important this facility is for Egypt's food security? There's also another not-so-obvious benefit to having such a farm around. This is the largest project of its kind in the Middle East, which obviously attracts a lot of local experts from the aquaculture field. In the future, technologies can be developed there and then sold to other countries, which means extra money for the not-so-wealthy Egypt. Besides, the project will bring in money for the development of the Suez Canal and the Sinai Peninsula, as it involves additional construction of industrial facilities and urban settlements near the Alfuse farm. Now we're moving to the western part of the Nile Delta. Here there's another similar facility called Burket Gallion. Spread across 3,950 acres, there are 1,359 fish ponds, including 83 ponds for freshwater species. There's also an incubator and spaces for producing fry with a capacity of 20 million marine fish. Of course, there's also a research area where scientists carry out various studies related to the fish being raised here. There's an industrial zone covering 55 acres with a fish processing and packaging plant that has a production capacity of 100 tons per day. There's also a feed production plant with an output of 180,000 tons per year and an ice production plant. In general, just like the facility we talked about earlier, this place has everything needed for fish farming. In the first phase of operations in 2017, the facility was supplying 13,800 tons of fish per year, and now the numbers continue to improve. These two major sites in the sands of Egypt alone produce an enormous amount of fish, and they're developing, which will mean even more food for the country in the future. And now, the amazing fact. The two largest facilities, along with all the others, don't even make up half of the fish produced in Egypt, not even 60%. In total, about 86% of the country's fish production comes from private individuals and small farmers. They grow fish in the sand all over Egypt, mostly focusing on the areas with the best conditions, all along the Nile. Throughout the country's modern history, many individuals have been setting up farms of various sizes with ponds. If it's hard for someone to dig sand and prepare the future fish breeding site, it's not a problem. Egyptians have been using these pools with liquid for a long time, which just need to be placed in the right spot, and then fish can be released into them. At the same time, in such ponds, some Egyptian families use technologies that are not quite typical for private aquaculture in the country. For example, Egyptians use a smart fish greenhouse to grow tilapia, where various systems optimize water usage. Yes, controlling water consumption is really important because, just like with food, there are issues with water in Egypt. The country has the Nile, the only stable water source, providing more than 90% of its water resources. Some articles even say that Egypt is 97% dependent on its main river for water. However, that's not so important, because even with it, Egypt faces a drinking water deficit of 1.8 trillion gallons each year. Right now, each person in Egypt has access to 148,000 gallons of water per year, which is below the official water poverty line of 264,000 gallons. Experts also predict that for various reasons, including rapid population growth, by 2030, each Egyptian will get even less water. Meanwhile, aquaculture in Egypt requires a huge amount of water. Still, researchers, scientists, and lots of other people who study water issues don't get paid for nothing in this country, which is why Egypt tries to make the most out of its water. Look, there's a pond they filled with water and they're farming fish in it. Aquatic creatures, like all living things, generate waste in the process of living, and it floats around in the water. That waste is full of stuff that's really good for plants, so it can be used perfectly well to fertilize crops. Plants in turn filter the water, taking out all the good stuff, which makes it better for the fish, so the water used for irrigation can then be used to raise fish. And the Egyptians really make use of this. They build canal systems that connect fish farms with crop fields. In the end, you get more food while using less water, perfect for Egypt's desert conditions, where water's the most precious resource. However, Egypt's private aquaculture has its issues too, and some of them are pretty unexpected. For instance, small-scale fish farmers often point out that the government's push to dominate fish farming is actually damaging. When the government entered the market in 2015 and started building various mega projects like the ones we already talked about today, it slashed the budget of the General Authority for Fish Resources Development from $8 million down to $2.5 million. This body acts as a major regulator in the fishery sector and a support system for small farms. So with the budget cut, that support got weaker, and those relying on it had a harder time too. In 2018, Egypt's government raised the rent for private fish farmers tenfold, and as a result, they began falling into debt over and over again. Besides that, state-owned farms get exclusive access to cheap energy and are exempt from corporate income tax and VAT, which lets them sell fish at lower prices. Regular folks don't really care who they buy food from when the market isn't exactly overflowing and they're low on cash, so they go for the cheaper fish, that is, the state-produced one. Private entrepreneurs end up with even less money to pay rent and taxes. All in all, this leads to a situation where many farmers just switch to agriculture or other fields, abandoning their fish business. Some farmers don't abandon aquaculture entirely, but switch to raising fish in more polluted and salty water. This, in turn, seriously affects the quality of the product. But despite all that, overall, Egypt's desert aquaculture sector keeps growing every year, which is definitely good news for both the government and the people. A great example of how lifeless sand can turn into a source of food.